Hey guys! Tonight, we're doing one of those topics that sounds cozy on paper and then slowly reveals that absolutely no one was having a good time. So go ahead and dim the lights. Put the phone face down. Loosen your jaw. Pretend tomorrow doesn't exist. Because we're easing into the strangely exhausting world of historical morning routines and household work, the royal edition. Not the cute version. The real one. The one with servants everywhere, yet somehow no privacy. The one where waking up was a public performance. And yes, people were already disappointed in you before breakfast. So let's drift gently backward in time, into bedrooms that smelled faintly of damp stone, old wool, and anxiety. And let's start where all bad days begin. With morning. For most medieval and early modern royals, waking up was not a private moment. There was no quiet stretch, no staring at the ceiling, no lying there thinking about absolutely nothing. The second a monarch opened their eyes, they were on. Or at least, observed. In many courts, the act of waking was ceremonial. Literally ceremonial. French kings perfected this into an art form called the lever, which is exactly what it sounds like. A structured, hierarchical ritual of watching a man get out of bed. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, did not simply wake up. He received his morning. First came the inner circle. The most trusted nobles. These were the people allowed to watch the king sit up and acknowledge existence. Then came the slightly less important nobles, who could watch him put on a robe. Then more people. Then more. Because why not turn personal hygiene into a spectator sport? By the time Louis had reached the stage of putting on stockings, the room could contain dozens of people. Some of them had traveled hours for the privilege of seeing a calf. This wasn't intimacy. It was power. If you were allowed near the bed, you mattered. If you weren't, well, enjoy your obscurity. And yes, this meant the king never woke up alone. Not once. Which explains a lot, actually. Now, mornings were technically about hygiene, but hygiene is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Bathing was rare. Suspiciously rare. Water was seen as dangerous. It could open pores. Let disease sneak in. So instead of bathing, people changed clothes. Or added perfume. Or just hoped for the best. Royal morning washing usually meant a quick rinse of hands and face, maybe with scented water if you were fancy. Teeth were cleaned with cloths, powders, or small sticks. Sometimes honey was involved. Sometimes chalk. Sometimes absolutely nothing. Fresh breath was not a realistic goal. It was more of a philosophical concept. And yet, servants were everywhere. Holding basins. Offering towels. Standing very still, pretending not to notice things they absolutely noticed. Because royal households ran on a strict code of selective blindness. Let's talk about servants, actually. Because while royals were technically doing nothing, hundreds of people had already been awake for hours. Royal households were massive. Entire ecosystems. Kitchens alone could employ dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers. Bakers started before dawn. Fire tenders had been up all night keeping embers alive. Laundry workers were already knee-deep in freezing water, scrubbing linen that would never truly be clean. Morning work was relentless. Floors swept. Tapestries beaten. Chamber pots emptied. Yes. That job existed. Someone had to do it. And no, it was not a stepping stone to glory. While the king was deciding which wig best matched his mood, servants were hauling water, carrying wood, preparing breakfasts that would be eaten slowly and criticized thoroughly. And still, the king might complain. Breakfast itself was an unpredictable affair. Some monarchs ate lightly. A bit of bread. Some wine. Maybe broth. Others treated breakfast as an extension of last night's feast. Meat. Cheese. More wine. Always wine. Water was for peasants and people who enjoyed dysentery. Henry VIII, for example, woke up hungry. Very hungry. Breakfast could include beef, bread, ale, and fruit. This was not indulgence. This was maintenance. The man burned calories like a small bonfire fueled by ego. He would eat. And eat. And then later wonder why his joints hurt. A mystery for the ages. Meanwhile, royal children were often forced into rigid routines early. Up at dawn. Prayers. Lessons. No cuddling. No softness. Just discipline and expectation wrapped in miniature clothing. And yes, many of them hated it. Let's gently float over to Spain for a moment. Because no one did dysfunctional mornings quite like the Habsburgs. Spanish Habsburg royalty woke up surrounded by protocol and chronic illness. Many kings suffered from jaw deformities, digestive issues, and general exhaustion that came from centuries of enthusiastic cousin marriage. Charles II of Spain, the famously inbred king, reportedly struggled with basic daily functions. Dressing him could take hours. Eating was difficult. Standing upright was an achievement. Mornings were slow. Painful. Assisted. Servants dressed him piece by piece. Shoes. Stockings. Coats. Everything adjusted carefully. Not for comfort. But because his body simply did not cooperate. And yet, the court pretended this was normal. Perfectly fine. Nothing to see here. Because admitting something was wrong would mean admitting that dynastic decisions had consequences. And that was simply unacceptable. Household work didn't stop with cleaning and cooking. Royal households were administrative machines. Morning meant paperwork. Letters dictated. Petitions reviewed. Requests denied politely. Or not politely. Kings and queens often held morning audiences. People lined up with complaints, requests, and grievances. They wanted land. Money. Justice. Favor. Or forgiveness for last night's terrible decision. Some rulers loved this. Others despised it. Queen Elizabeth I preferred to be mentally prepared before facing people. She took time. She dressed slowly. She controlled her image meticulously. Every detail mattered. Hair, makeup, expression. Because for her, being seen was being judged. And she planned to win. Still, even she couldn't escape the constant presence of attendants. Ladies-in-waiting helped dress her, style her hair, manage her wardrobe. They knew everything. Every wrinkle. Every scar. Every mood. Privacy was a myth. Now, let's not forget the less glamorous side of household work. The emotional labor. Servants didn't just clean. They listened. They absorbed tension. They navigated fragile egos before caffeine existed. They learned when to speak and when to disappear. When to offer comfort and when to remain invisible. A wrong tone in the morning could cost a job. Or worse. And yet, many servants spent decades in service. Entire lives passed inside palace walls. Watching generations rise and fall. Kings age. Queens grieve. Children grow into disappointments. Morning after morning, the same routines. The same corridors. The same quiet exhaustion. What's fascinating is how little rest anyone actually got. Beds were uncomfortable. Sleep was interrupted by noise, drafts, and anxiety. Royals worried about plots. Servants worried about mistakes. Everyone worried about fire. So mornings came too soon. Always too soon. And yet, the rituals continued. Because routine was stability. And stability was survival. Even when the routines were absurd. Even when they hurt. By the time a royal day truly began, hundreds of small tasks had already been completed. Invisible labor stacked neatly beneath visible power. The king rose. But the household had been awake for hours. And tomorrow, they would do it all again. So settle deeper into the pillow. Let the stone corridors fade. Let the murmured footsteps soften. In the next part, we'll drift further into the household itself, where hierarchy decided who touched the laundry, who touched the crown, and who touched absolutely nothing of importance. But for now, just rest. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything way down. Turn the lights low. Let the room get quiet. Let your brain stop trying to be productive for once. Because tonight, we're slipping gently into one of history's most exhausting institutions. Royal marriage. Not the fairy tale version. Not the sparkly dress and happy ending. The real one. The one where love was optional, duty was mandatory, and happiness was negotiable at best. So take a breath. Sink into the pillow. Because for the next while, we're talking about people who technically had everything, except freedom. Or privacy. Or emotional fulfillment. Or sometimes basic compatibility. And yes, they still had to smile. Royal marriage was never about romance. That idea came much later, and even then, it struggled to survive court politics. Marriage was paperwork. Marriage was diplomacy. Marriage was a walking, talking treaty with a pulse. When a prince or princess was born, their future spouse was already being discussed somewhere. Sometimes before they could walk. Sometimes before they could survive infancy. Engagements were negotiated like land deals. Who got what? Who promised troops? Who promised money? Who promised to stop fighting for at least a few years? And the child at the center of it all? They were decorative. Let's start with the basics. Royal children did not choose their partners. Ever. That was not a thing. Attraction was irrelevant. Personality was irrelevant. Shared interests were extremely irrelevant. What mattered was bloodline. And sometimes, very specific bloodlines. This is where things get weird. Slowly. Casually. Quietly weird. Because European royalty developed a strong preference for marrying each other. Over and over. Cousins. Second cousins. Nieces. Sometimes uncles. The family tree began to fold in on itself like a tired piece of paper. The Habsburgs, of course, leaned into this the hardest. They treated marriage like a recycling program. Why look outside the family when you already had so many options inside it? And yes, they noticed the consequences. They just ignored them. Marriages often happened young. Very young. Girls could be betrothed as toddlers. Married in their early teens. Sometimes younger. Boys had slightly more time, but not much. Once married, expectations were immediate. Produce heirs. Preferably male. Preferably quickly. Preferably without dying. Which was optimistic. Royal brides were watched closely. Their cycles monitored. Their health scrutinized. Their bodies became state property. Every missed period sparked rumors. Every pregnancy was announced, celebrated, prayed over, and feared. Because childbirth was dangerous. Even for queens. Especially for queens. And yet, there was no opting out. Let's gently drift over to France for a moment. Marie Antoinette arrived at the French court as a teenager. She was foreign. Austrian. Already disliked. And immediately married to a boy who was just as young, awkward, and deeply uninterested in intimacy. Louis XVI was not cruel. He was not dramatic. He was just uncomfortable. Reserved. Possibly anxious. Possibly confused. Possibly very tired. For years, their marriage was unconsummated. Years. The court noticed. Of course they did. They always noticed. Whispers spread. Jokes circulated. Political tension grew. Because if the queen wasn't producing heirs, then what exactly was she doing? Marie Antoinette was blamed. Naturally. She was criticized for everything. Her spending. Her clothes. her friends, her hobbies, her personality, her existence. All while being trapped in a marriage where she had no power, no privacy, and no emotional safety. Romantic. Truly. Royal husbands weren't exactly free either. Kings were expected to marry advantageously. To be faithful enough to produce legitimate heirs, but not so faithful that they skipped mistresses entirely. Mistresses were unofficially accepted. Sometimes openly acknowledged. Sometimes housed nearby. Queens had to tolerate this. Publicly. Quietly. Gracefully. Jealousy was considered unbecoming. Anger was dangerous. Silence was survival. Some queens managed this with composure. Others internalized it. Some broke down slowly over years. Others found small rebellions. Private friendships. Secret letters. Religious devotion. Or emotional withdrawal. Because divorce was almost never an option. Unless you were Henry VIII. But we'll get to him eventually. He deserves his own emotional support group. Let's float over to Spain again. Because it's always Spain. Spanish queens lived under intense restriction. Dress codes were strict. Behavior was monitored. Public appearances were controlled. Personal friendships were limited. Queens were expected to be pious, quiet, obedient, and fertile. Ideally all at once. Isabella of Portugal, wife of Charles V, managed this role well. She governed while he was away. She produced heirs. She upheld court expectations. And then she died young. Exhausted. After multiple pregnancies. Charles never fully recovered emotionally. Which sounds touching. Until you remember that he remarried within the same dynastic circle anyway. Because feelings were real, but politics were stronger. Now let's talk about the emotional restrictions. Because these are easy to overlook. Royal marriages were public performances. Affection was staged. Distance was scrutinized. Everything was interpreted. Too close. Suspicious. Too distant. Scandalous. Too happy. Probably fake. Too unhappy. Dangerous. Couples rarely spent time alone. Servants were always nearby. Doors were rarely closed. Even bedrooms were semi-public spaces. Imagine trying to build intimacy while someone stands 3 feet away holding a candle and pretending not to hear you breathe. Exactly. Royal wives were also expected to adapt instantly to foreign courts. New language. New customs. New food. New power structures. Often with no allies. Many queens arrived as teenagers, leaving everything familiar behind. Their families. Their homes. Their sense of self. They were expected to transform overnight into symbols of stability and grace. If they failed, it wasn't because the system was cruel. It was because they were inadequate. That narrative was very convenient. Let's gently slide into England. Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII believing she was fulfilling a sacred duty. She endured miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths. Again and again. She prayed. She fasted. She blamed herself. Henry, meanwhile, grew impatient, frustrated, bored. And when Catherine could no longer give him a male heir, her value collapsed. Years of loyalty erased. Marriage reduced to a technical problem. She was pushed aside. Publicly. Slowly. Painfully. All while maintaining dignity that history rarely rewards. Royal children born into these marriages inherited the weight immediately. They were raised to understand that their future marriages would not be about them. That love was a distraction. That duty came first. Some accepted this. Some resented it. Some broke under it. Mental health was not discussed. Emotional needs were ignored. Melancholy was considered a moral failing. And so generations of royals moved through life emotionally underdeveloped, socially restricted, and deeply isolated. With excellent posture. What's striking is how normalized all of this was. People didn't question the system. They justified it. They wrote poetry about sacrifice. They called it noble, necessary, divine. And maybe it was necessary, politically. But humanly, it was exhausting. Marriage was not comfort. It was obligation. And love, when it appeared, was often inconvenient. Or dangerous. Or both. So as you settle deeper into the quiet, let these stories blur softly together. Dresses rustling. Contracts signed. Promises made by people too young to understand them. In the next part, we'll drift further into the consequences. The loneliness. The infidelity. The quiet emotional collapses that came from being owned by a crown. But for now, rest easy. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything way down. Put the phone on the nightstand. Let the room go dim. Unclench your shoulders. Because tonight, we're settling into one of those history topics that sounds warm and gentle, and then slowly becomes very tired and very sad. Motherhood. But the royal version. Not the soft focus painting version. Not the glowing queen holding a perfect baby. The real one. The one with constant pregnancy, medical guesswork, religious guilt, and the unspoken understanding that your body now belonged to the state. So get comfortable. Because we're drifting into centuries of women whose job description was basically be fertile. Stay alive. Don't complain. And spoiler. Many of them did not get all three. Royal motherhood began early. Sometimes alarmingly early. Girls were raised knowing exactly why they existed. Not subtly. Not gently. They were told. Sometimes directly. Sometimes through constant reminders. Their value was measured in heirs. — preferably sons. Ideally several. Because infant mortality was high, and hope was not a strategy. Once married, pregnancy was expected almost immediately. A queen who did not conceive quickly was considered a problem. Not unlucky. Not stressed. A problem. Courts whispered. Ambassadors reported. Physicians were consulted. Priests prayed. Everyone watched her body like it was a public project. And the queen herself? She waited. And worried. And blamed herself. Pregnancy in the medieval and early modern world was not restful. There were no ultrasounds. No prenatal vitamins. No real understanding of infection or nutrition. Pregnant queens followed strict rules. Some helpful. Many, not. They were told what to eat. What not to eat. When to pray. How to sit. How to think. Emotional distress was believed to affect the baby, so women were expected to remain calm at all times. Which is adorable, considering they were usually surrounded by political tension, gossip, and a constant fear of dying in childbirth. But sure. Stay calm. Childbirth itself was an experience. It took place in a lying-in chamber. Curtains drawn. Windows covered. Light minimized. Air stale. Because drafts were dangerous. Fresh air was suspicious. Midwives took charge. Male doctors were rarely allowed inside. This was one of the few spaces dominated by women. Experienced women. Practical women. Women who had seen this go wrong many times before. Queens were surrounded by attendants. Female relatives. Ladies in waiting. Priests sometimes waited outside, just in case things went badly and a quick prayer was needed. And they often did go badly. Labor could last hours. Days. Sometimes longer. Pain relief did not exist. Comfort was minimal. Encouragement was spiritual, not medical. Women were told to endure. To accept suffering as part of their role. As part of divine order. If complications arose, there was little anyone could do. Infection. Hemorrhage. Obstructed labor. These were often fatal. And if the queen died, well, at least she had done her duty. That was the quiet logic. Let's drift gently to England. Catherine of Aragon became pregnant at least 6 times. Possibly more. Most of her children did not survive infancy. Only Mary lived. Each loss chipped away at her health. Physically. Emotionally. Spiritually. She fasted. She prayed. She blamed herself. She believed God was testing her. Or punishing her. Or asking for more patience. Henry VIII watched all of this. At first with sympathy. Later with frustration. Eventually with resentment. Because Catherine's body was failing him politically. Which is a brutal way to be viewed. Pregnancy did not end the scrutiny. After birth, the pressure intensified. If the child was male, celebrations erupted. Bells rang. Feasts were held. Coins were thrown. The queen was praised. If the child was female, the reaction was polite, restrained, controlled. Disappointment was often masked. Barely. Queens knew the difference immediately. They felt it in the room, in the tone of voices, in how long people stayed. And if the baby died shortly after birth, grief was complicated. Mothers mourned privately. Publicly, they were expected to recover quickly, to conceive again, to keep going. Because one dead baby was tragic. But too many dead babies. That reflected poorly on the mother. Now let's float over to France. Marie de Medici gave birth to 6 children. She survived childbirth, which already put her ahead of many queens. But survival did not mean comfort. She suffered from anxiety, from insecurity, from constant criticism. Her body had done what it was supposed to do. But her personality was considered wrong. Too emotional. Too needy. Too foreign. Motherhood did not protect her. It rarely did. Royal mothers were expected to be symbols, not individuals. Their emotions were inconvenient. And then there's Spain. Again. Always Spain. Spanish queens endured near constant pregnancy. The Habsburg obsession with producing heirs was relentless. Queens gave birth again and again, often with little recovery time between. Margaret of Austria, wife of Philip III, had 8 children. She died at 26. Possibly from complications related to childbirth. 26. That's not a long life. That's barely adulthood. But she was praised as a model queen. Devout. Fertile. Self-sacrificing. Which tells you everything. Royal health after childbirth was fragile. Infections were common. Fevers. Weakness. Chronic pain. Depression, though it had no name. Postpartum mental health struggles were misunderstood. A queen who withdrew was considered cold. Or unstable. Or ungrateful. There was no space for healing. No concept of rest beyond a few weeks of lying in. And then it was back to duty. Smile. Attend court. Prepare for the next pregnancy. Children, when they survived, were often taken from their mothers early. Royal nurseries were run by nurses and governesses. Mothers saw their children on schedules. Sometimes briefly. Sometimes formally. Emotional bonding was not prioritized. Survival and discipline were. This separation could be painful. But it was normalized. Queens learned not to show attachment. Attachment made loss harder. And loss was common. Some queens distanced themselves deliberately. As a form of self-protection. Others couldn't. And suffered quietly. Let's gently slide toward Austria. Maria Theresa of Austria had 16 children. 16. She survived. Which is almost unbelievable. She ruled an empire while managing pregnancies, miscarriages, and the deaths of multiple children. She loved her children fiercely. She wrote to them constantly. She worried. She meddled. She arranged their marriages with ruthless efficiency. Because she knew exactly what awaited them. She had lived it. And even she, powerful as she was, could not escape the physical toll. Her health declined. Her energy waned. Motherhood had cost her dearly. The irony is that royal women had access to wealth, servants, and comfort, and yet were medically helpless. They could afford the finest physicians. And those physicians often made things worse. Bloodletting. Purging. Questionable remedies. Religious advice disguised as treatment. Science lagged far behind suffering. And the women paid the price. What lingers most is how quietly this all happened. No screaming headlines. No dramatic moments. Just cycle after cycle of pregnancy, pain, loss, and expectation. Queens died. New queens replaced them. The system continued. And history often remembers them only as mothers. Or failures at motherhood. Rarely as people. So as your breathing slows, let these lives blur softly together. Cradles. Candles. Prayer beads. Tired bodies. Quiet endurance. In the next part, we'll drift further into the consequences of all this. The sickly children. The fragile heirs. The dynasties shaped by bodies that simply couldn't keep up with expectations. But for now, rest. Hey guys. Tonight, we're doing one of those topics that history almost never raises its voice about. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the room get still. Let your thoughts slow down just a little. Because tonight, we're talking about the people who carried entire dynasties, and rarely got credit for it. Quiet strength. The unrecorded kind. The kind that doesn't come with statues or dramatic speeches. The kind that just keeps going. So take a breath. Because we're drifting into the soft, shadowed corners of palaces. The places where history didn't bother to write much down. And we're starting with people who endured everything, said very little, and were still somehow expected to smile. History loves loud figures. Kings who shouted. Queens who schemed. Rulers who conquered. But most royal lives were not loud. They were repetitive. Controlled. And deeply constrained. For every monarch remembered as great, there were dozens of people around them holding everything together quietly. Spouses. Mothers. Siblings. Regents. Ladies-in-waiting. Unmarried daughters. Younger sons who would never inherit anything except responsibility. They didn't lead armies. They absorbed pressure. And that pressure rarely made it into the record. Let's start gently, in the background of a royal court. Imagine a woman who was married young. Not for love. For alliance. She moved to a foreign country. New language. New customs. New expectations. She never complained publicly. Because she couldn't. She learned the rules quickly. When to speak. When not to. Who mattered. Who didn't. How to survive emotionally while appearing composed. She gave birth. Maybe many times. Lost children. Maybe several. Buried them quietly. Returned to court functions soon after. Because grief was inconvenient. And history remembers her as dutiful. That's it. That's the entire summary. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters, for example. Not Eleanor herself. She gets plenty of attention. But her daughters, the ones sent off to marriages across Europe. Married into unfamiliar courts. Expected to produce heirs. Expected to adapt instantly. Their letters, when they survive, are cautious. Polite. Carefully worded. They ask about home. They mention health. They do not complain openly. Because letters could be read. And honesty was risky. These women held alliances together by existing quietly in difficult places. No one wrote poems about that. Let's float over to Spain again. Because Spain is basically a case study in quiet endurance. Spanish royal women were expected to be pious, restrained, obedient, and emotionally invisible. Strength was expressed through silence. Queens like Isabel of Portugal, wife of Charles V, governed competently while her husband traveled endlessly. She ruled Spain in his absence. She made decisions. Managed crises. Balanced factions. And yet, she did it calmly. Without spectacle. Without branding herself as powerful. When she died young, worn down by childbirth and responsibility, she was praised for her virtue. Not her competence. Which feels on brand for history. Quiet strength wasn't limited to women. Younger sons lived entire lives in the shadow of heirs. Trained for service. For church roles. For military command without glory. They were loyal. Useful. Replaceable. They supported brothers who inherited crowns. Sometimes brothers they didn't like. Sometimes brothers who were unstable. Or incompetent. Or both. And they stayed. Because duty. Take Prince Henry Frederick, elder brother of Charles I of England. He was groomed for kingship. Intelligent. Athletic. Popular. And then he died young. Charles inherited everything. Including expectations he wasn't ready for. Charles's quiet endurance came later. Through years of pressure. Conflict. Emotional isolation. He believed deeply in duty. Even when it cost him everything. History focuses on the end. Not the years of restraint before it. Let's gently slide toward Austria. Habsburg courts were emotionally cold places. Formal. Hierarchical. Restrictive. Children were raised with affection rationed carefully. Praise was rare. Approval conditional. Many Habsburg archduchesses lived lives of religious devotion after politically useful marriages fell through. They entered convents. Not always by choice. But they adapted. They became administrators, educators, patrons, quiet leaders in enclosed spaces. They managed estates, correspondence, charitable work, without public recognition. Because convent walls absorbed ambition just as effectively as palace walls. Quiet sacrifice also lived in daily routines. Ladies-in-waiting served queens for decades. They dressed them, accompanied them, watched them grieve, watched them age, watched them die. They managed secrets. They heard confessions that never made it into memoirs. They absorbed emotional fallout. And when queens were dismissed, exiled, or replaced, the ladies adjusted. Because they had to. Their loyalty rarely earned them security. Let's float over to France. Madame de Maintenon, the second wife of Louis XIV, lived in constant restraint. She had influence, yes. But no official recognition. No crown. No public acknowledgement. She walked carefully. Spoke carefully. Controlled herself constantly. Because a misstep could erase everything. Her strength was not flamboyant. It was calculated. She held the king's trust quietly. And history still debates whether she mattered at all. Which tells you how subtle her role was. Quiet strength also lived in mothers whose children never ruled. Royal women who gave birth to daughters only. Or sons who died young. Or heirs who were passed over. They endured the quiet disappointment of courts that stopped paying attention. They faded from political relevance. But they still existed. They still advised. Wrote letters. Managed households. Supported relatives. Their usefulness just became invisible. One of the saddest forms of quiet sacrifice was emotional containment. Royal individuals were trained not to express fear, or anger, or despair. Melancholy was considered weakness, especially in women. So they learned to swallow emotions, to redirect them into prayer, or routine, or service. They learned how to appear calm while living with constant uncertainty. That takes strength. A very specific kind. Let's drift gently to Prussia. Queen Louise of Prussia is remembered for her grace and popularity. But behind that image was relentless pressure. She supported her husband through military failures. She reassured her children during exile. She maintained morale. She died young. Worn down. Exhausted. Her strength was visible. But its cost wasn't. History tends to record outcomes. Not endurance. It notes who ruled. Who won. Who lost. It rarely notes who waited. Who endured quietly. who held families together behind closed doors. Those people did not write manifestos. They wrote letters. They showed up. They stayed composed. And that doesn't translate well into textbooks. What's striking is how many of these individuals never expected recognition. They were raised knowing their role was supportive. Secondary. Background. So they adapted. They found meaning in small things. Routine. Faith. Relationships. Letters. Gardens. Charitable work. They carved out private lives inside public roles. And that might be the quietest strength of all. As your breathing slows, let these lives blur gently together. Soft footsteps in corridors. Candles burning low. Letters folded carefully. Words chosen with caution. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the emotional costs of this quiet endurance. The loneliness. The unacknowledged grief. The small rebellions that never made headlines. But for now. Rest. Hey guys. Let's ease back in. Nothing sharp. Nothing dramatic. Just let the last thoughts fade out like background noise. We're still in the same place. Stone corridors. Low voices. Soft footsteps. History doing its thing, mostly without noticing the people holding it together. Because part 2 is where the quiet strength starts to cost something. Not all at once. Just slowly. Day by day. And this is where endurance turns into loneliness. One of the strangest things about royal life is how crowded it was, and how alone people still felt. Palaces were full. Servants everywhere. Courtiers watching constantly. Letters arriving. Messengers leaving. Noise. Movement. Ceremony. And yet, emotionally, silence. People learned early that their inner lives were not welcome. Feelings were not currency. They were liabilities. So emotions were tucked away. Managed. Controlled. Or redirected into acceptable outlets. Prayer. Routine. Duty. And when that wasn't enough, people just endured. Let's drift gently toward a familiar figure, but look at her sideways this time. Queen Victoria is usually remembered as stern, black-dressed, emotionally intense. And yes, she was all of that. But what often gets overlooked is how much quiet endurance her life required before she ever became powerful. She lost her father as a baby. Grew up isolated. Controlled by a system designed to keep her dependent. Watched constantly. Protected from almost everyone. When she became queen, she clung fiercely to Prince Albert. Not just out of love, but because he became her emotional anchor. Her translator. Her buffer. And when he died, her grief wasn't theatrical. It was consuming. And prolonged. And isolating. She kept ruling. She kept appearing. She kept functioning. But inside, she never really recovered. History frames her mourning as excessive. But from another angle, it was the release of decades of suppressed vulnerability. Quiet strength also meant absorbing other people's failures. Royal wives supported husbands who made bad decisions. Sons who disappointed. Brothers who embarrassed the family. Daughters who were unhappy in marriages arranged by the very system they upheld. And they did this without public complaint. Take Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Sisi. Romanticized endlessly. Beautiful. Free-spirited. Tragic. But underneath that image was a woman deeply uncomfortable with her role. She hated court life. Hated restriction. Hated being watched. She withdrew. Traveled constantly. Focused obsessively on her appearance. Her body. Her routines. People called her eccentric. Or dramatic. But it looks a lot like someone coping quietly with a life she never chose. Let's float back to Spain. Again. Because Spain never runs out of material. Queen Mariana of Austria married her uncle. Yes. Her uncle. Because dynasties do what dynasties do. She became regent for her sickly son, Charles II. A boy so fragile that his survival felt almost accidental. Mariana governed through intrigue, criticism, and constant scrutiny. She was accused of manipulation, of incompetence, of emotional instability. But she kept going. She navigated a collapsing dynasty while caring for a chronically ill child who was also the king. That kind of strength doesn't look heroic. It looks tired. One of the quietest sacrifices was self-erasure. Many royal women lost their names after marriage. Became queen of instead of themselves. Their personal identities dissolved into titles. Their tastes were adjusted. Their accents corrected. Their habits reshaped to fit local expectations. Over time, they became symbols instead of people. And symbols don't get to complain. Quiet endurance also lived in exile. Deposed royals. Widowed queens. Dowagers. People once central to power, suddenly irrelevant. They lived out their days in reduced households. Smaller courts. Less ceremony. Less attention. Sometimes this was peaceful. Sometimes humiliating. Marie Lesksinska, wife of Louis XV, lived a quiet, constrained life. Her husband openly preferred mistresses. She withdrew into piety and routine. She didn't fight. She didn't rebel. She simply endured. History remembers her as dull. Which is unfair. But predictable. There's also the quiet endurance of those who almost mattered. Princesses who were close to inheritance but not quite there. Regents who governed temporarily and were then dismissed. Advisors who were indispensable until they weren't. Their lives were defined by usefulness. And usefulness had an expiration date. When that date passed, they adapted. Or faded. Quietly. Let's gently slide to Russia. Tsarina Alexandra is often blamed for everything. political collapse, poor judgment, emotional instability. But strip away the hindsight, and you see a woman isolated in a foreign court. Hated for her accent, her reserve, her faith. She bore multiple daughters before finally producing a son with a life-threatening condition. She lived in constant fear for him. She withdrew. She clung to religion. She trusted the wrong people. Was she flawed? Yes. Was she alone? Completely. Her strength took the form of loyalty, even when it destroyed her. Quiet sacrifice also meant accepting blame. Queens were blamed for infertility, for sickly children, for political unrest, for cultural shifts, for anything that felt wrong. They absorbed criticism meant for systems they didn't control. And often, they believed it. They internalized failure as personal, which is one of the most damaging forms of endurance. Let's not forget the men who endured quietly either. Kings raised to suppress emotion, to perform certainty, to never admit fear. Some succeeded. Others cracked slowly. George III of Britain struggled with mental illness. He endured episodes of confusion and distress while trying to maintain dignity. His suffering was politicized, mocked, feared. But for years, he continued performing kingship through sheer force of will. That's a kind of quiet strength too. Even when it failed. What connects all these lives is not drama. It's restraint. They didn't scream. They didn't revolt. They adapted. And adaptation is exhausting. Especially when it's lifelong. As you settle deeper into rest, let the weight of all that quiet effort soften. Let it blur into candlelight and murmured prayers. Let the constant expectations fade into the background. In the next part, we'll drift toward the smallest acts of resistance. The subtle ways these people reclaimed slivers of control. Habits. Routines. Obsessions. Comforts. Nothing loud. Nothing revolutionary. Just enough to survive.